Hello, welcome to the special edition of the Lowdown. Today we have a special guest. We're going to talk about an industry that I think is a big opportunity, something I haven't seen as this big of an opportunity in a long time, and that's the space and defense. And joining us today is Jim Cantrell. Jim is the CEO and co-founder of Phantom Space Exploration, and also you were partnered with Elon Musk and one of the founders of SpaceX.
Yep, yeah, it was.
Also, you've written a book called Breaking All the Rules, so if anyone's interested in the space exploration and your background, it's a great book, by the way. Enjoy the read.
I appreciate that.
So yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, Jim, I grew up in Clear Lake, so I've been around the NASA, been around space all my life. I remember as a little kid just, fascinated by it. But, something's changed. I mean, back then, NASA was the authority. I mean, if anything space that was involved, NASA was the go-to. And then it just kind of felt like for the last 20 years, there was kind of a void for a while. And there's basically a change into the guard. And I thought maybe you could just start off telling us about the new industry, the new opportunity in space.
Yeah, so NASA, as you point out, was really the leader in the space industry in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the early days, only nation states had the capital, both intellectual and financial, to go to space. And private enterprise really didn't. And over time, commercial space started to creep in the late 70s, 80s with commercial communication satellites. And some of you old enough might remember the large dishes in people's backyards that would talk to the geo satellites, which are up 28,000 miles up in the air. But over time, that became a very mature industry, but not until I would say probably the early 2000s did this new commercial venture take off in space. And a lot of this was started by SpaceX, but really the roots of it came from the early days of NASA. And after we got done with Apollo and going to the moon, we had something called the Space Shuttle, which most of you remember. And that was really to cover a lot of the jobs that needed to be done and give NASA something to do. And NASA's really I view it as a mission-oriented kind of agency, but slowly became less and less efficient at building what we need to go to space. In the early days, they were the only ones that could, and clearly none of this is meant as a criticism. It's just simply a recognition that over time, the bureaucracy's got inefficient. So now what we have is the nation-state oriented industry has really transitioned to a capitalist private industry, which then services NASA's needs, services a growing commercial effort in space. And you see things like Starlink, which even my 96-year-old father-in-law has a Starlink satellite dish on his house, which uses, instead of 10 or 20 satellites in geostationary orbit, 5,000, a lot closer to the Earth.
Wow. Well, my dad's in East Texas, and so the only way I'm getting him cable and an internet service is through Starlink. So I understand that.
It's a great service.
Yeah, yes, it is. Well, earlier you and I were having a conversation, and you kind of broke down the opportunity by percentage. I thought maybe you could expand on that for us.
Yeah, great question. So the space industry is a $450 billion a year industry, and about 18 billion of that 450 a year is in launch services. So you can't necessarily become this huge company on that. The satellite manufacturing is about 28 billion, and the rest is in services. So it's communication, moving bits from place to place on the Earth. And the other part of it is, taking images of the Earth. I call it photons of decision quality information. So ultimately, it's about an information system, no different than our terrestrial information. So most of the money that's to be made in space is going to be on the services side. So that's why SpaceX in particular has been so successful, is they've combined this ability to launch something, build satellites, and then create a service which is touching everybody's lives these days. And they're tapping into that very, very big market.
Well, tell us about your company, Phantom, and what is the opportunity that you're participating in or trying to participate in?
Sure. So Phantom Space, we seek to be the Henry Ford of space and to make space access more universal and a lot more rapid. SpaceX has done a great job, just like NASA before it. We stand on the shoulders of greatness, but we think that there's a next phase here where we can come in after SpaceX is much more focused on going to Mars and the moon, which they publicly state they will, and maintaining Starlink. And we think that the commercial industry will both continue to grow and continue to need launch and satellites built for them. So we're going to build the launch vehicle, which we're about a year away from our first launch, And we also build the satellites, and we have contracts on both sides of that. Then ultimately, we too will build a constellation for data transfer, which is more efficient in low Earth orbit. So we're about 25 people. We're centered in Tucson, Arizona. We're very cash efficient. So we know that space is very capital intensive, but we've managed it in such a way that we've only spent about $32 million to date, and we're about a year away from launch. That compares with something on the order of $500 million to $1 billion from some of our peers. So we're clearly doing things a little differently, kind of like what we did in the early days of SpaceX.
Well, you know, it's capitalism's next frontier. I mean, it's fascinating, some of the stories I've seen since I've been, you know, open to the opportunity from you and from others. But, you know, we're not in it alone. And I think in a sense, it's the next space race. Where are we in comparison to other countries? What other players are involved? And I've heard say even this is you know, basically is almost like a national security issue at this point.
Yeah, so the way to think of space is it's just another domain for both warfare and for commerce. Sure. And it truly is the final frontier. I think of it much as you would think of the new frontier 500 years ago, okay, when Spain was sending galleons to the New World. They come back full of gold.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody could imagine what it would be today. Here we sit in the New World, and no Spaniard alive would have imagined this.
True.
So as we look forward into space, it's the same thing. All we can see is maybe the next 5 or 10 years. So it is ultimately both a military significant and a commercially significant. Those two things are linked. But the way I see space is really the place that's going to be an extension of our economy on the Earth, in the same way that Starlink is now becoming a very important part of our data networks.
Sure.
Think of it also like Manhattan, if you've been there. And before elevators, you didn't see skyscrapers because nobody had the energy to walk up 99 floors. And so by elevator technology coming along, we expanded the real estate vertically in cities, same here in Houston. And that is essentially what rockets and launch vehicles and satellites are doing, is expanding our ability to do business in space.
You know, a question I get all the time where people are asking is the United States ahead of China, or is China ahead of us? What is your thought on that, or where are we compared to China?
Well, we're ahead of them in a number of launches. We're ahead of them in a number of satellites. We're certainly ahead of them in commerce, right? In all factors. That is not to say that China is not doing anything. China's been very active for national security. They also have some commercial versions. I read the other day they have their own version of Starlink that's coming up. And okay, maybe it wasn't the original idea, but they're going to put something up very similar to it. So China has clearly replaced the Soviet Union as a global rival, a geopolitical rival to the United States. It's also a threat to our space systems because China understands through their own actions, plus observing how we fight wars.
Exactly.
We're very dependent on not only our commercial capabilities to keep a civil society, to keep the military running, but also space assets to conduct warfare.
Your former partner, he's dead set on getting to Mars, and I just thought I'd get your take on, one, is that something that could be accomplished, and also, is it something, what is your opinion of that as far as for mankind? Is that something necessary? Is that achievable?
Well, I'm going to start with the last question first.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, of course, Elon, this is what he has set out to do with his life. He told me that when he called me in 2001, that his whole goal was to make humanity and other life forms on Earth multiplanetary. So this is what he's going to do. He's a very goal-oriented person. I left SpaceX because that wasn't important to my life. I think it's an important goal. It's not what I want to do, right? So I do think that Elon is going to be one of the most important human beings in history. And I didn't necessarily think that in 2001. The reason I wrote my book was I felt like it had to be documented, this whole story of how Elon came to be, what led to that. There was a whole bunch of us who were really misfits and miscreants that didn't want to do what the government wanted us to do. And out of that came SpaceX and this new industry. An important story to tell. So, is it going to happen? Yes. I truly believe that, I don't think Elon will do it, but SpaceX will be putting the first humans on Mars. And I think that, you look at things like the Boring Company, when you put a filter of Mars over everything Elon does except for Twitter, it all fits Mars, right?
Yeah.
And the Boring machine will be not used to make freeways underground, but to put holes in the side of hills in Mars and
Populate.
That's where you're going to live.
Yeah.
It makes sense from all the physics and everything else. So, this is going to happen. It's going to happen in my lifetime, I believe, which I wouldn't have said 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, the technology has certainly expanded very rapidly, so I agree. We probably will see that in your lifetime, in my lifetime.
Right.
Well, Jim, look, I could spend all day with you. There's so much fascinating stories, but I appreciate the time you took today.
It's always a pleasure,
Thanks
Mike.
for having you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
pleasure to be here.
All right,
Yeah.
great.